Good day all. This is the first of my talks on how sociological theories work in over 30 minutes. These talks are, obviously, expanded versions of my talks on how these theories work in under 30 minutes. Each theory is now covered in 2 talks. The first provides a history of that theoretical tradition, focusing on identifying the big names, the central concepts, and the major events in that tradition. The second talk examines key issues in that tradition, looking at the theoretical debates which have taken place within sociology. Together, they show that even the examination of theory itself can be divided into history and theory, as with all of the topics that I cover. This talk will provide a history of the structuralist tradition in sociology. Structuralism was the first theoretical approach to emerge within sociology. The French structuralist Auguste Comte, who lived from 1798 to 1857, invented the word sociology, and so was the first sociologist. Now this, of course, does not mean that Comte was the first person ever to study society. The systematic attempt to understand how society works goes back to the philosophers of ancient Greece. But this means that for over 2,000 years, the study of society was seen as a branch of philosophy. But Comte was born into a Europe being transformed by science and industry, so he declared that the study of society must also become a science, the science of sociology. To enable the transition from philosophy to science, Comte developed his theory of positive philosophy, which these days is commonly shortened to positivism. Positivism is essentially a philosophy of science, and states that only science can establish positive, definite facts about the world through its use of experiment and observation. Comte argued that where philosophers were just armchair theorists, sociologists would develop theories based on social facts and scientific methods. Eventually, they would uncover the laws of society, or how society works, just as natural scientists were uncovering the laws of nature. Comte then proposed the first sociological model of society. He established its scientific nature by adapting a model taken from the natural sciences, specifically biology. Biologists had dissected the bodies of biological organisms, both animal and human, and had found that organisms are made up of organs. Each organ does something or performs a function which is necessary for survival. For example, the body has lungs that provide air, a heart that pumps blood, a stomach that digests food, and so on. Each organ is specialized, which means that they must all work together for the survival of the organism as a whole. In structuralist terms, the body is a biological system made up of specialized structures, each of which performs a function which is necessary for survival. Comte argued that society works the same way. Comte compared society to biology through his organic analogy. He argued that social structures are analogous to biological structures. Each social structure performs a function which is necessary for the survival of society. For example, society has the army to provide defense, the police to provide law and order, businesses to meet our material needs, religions to meet our spiritual needs, and so on. The body and society both have needs, so they both evolved specialized structures to meet those needs by performing necessary functions. This model is the starting point of the whole structuralist tradition in sociology. Comte's approach can be summed up in the saying, don't ask what it is, ask what it does. To understand something, you have to understand what it does, or what its function is. For Comte, nothing useless exists in nature or society. If it wasn't doing something useful, then it would never have come into existence in the first place. Everything in the body does something. But you can only understand what that thing does in the context of the body or society as a whole. For example, you can take a heart out of a body and weigh it and measure it and learn some things about it. But you can only understand the most important thing about it, namely that its function is to pump blood, when it's inside the body, pumping blood. Similarly, you can study social structures in isolation and learn some things about them, but to understand their purpose, you have to see what they do for society as a whole. Likewise, to understand any individual, you have to see what they do for society. You have to see how they fit into society and what they contribute to society to understand who they are. Comte did not believe in a fixed human nature. He argued that the individual has to fit into society, so as society changes, so does each individual, because the social roles we play and the social functions we perform shape the person that we become. He argued that our subjective side and our objective side have to fit together. How we think has to fit in with what we do. So, as we do things by playing social roles, we develop appropriate beliefs, attitudes, and values that support our actions. So, to understand that person subjectively, we have to see what that person does for society objectively. Comte also addressed an issue which in his time was called the problem of order. How is social order maintained? Or in other words, what keeps society together? What prevents each individual from just going off and doing their own thing? What prevents society from falling apart? This is where objective biological structures have their counterparts in subjective social structures. Your body is held together physically or objectively. Your hip bone connected to your thigh bone connected to your knee bone, and so on. But society is made up of millions of physically separate individuals. So what keeps them together? The answer is that they're held together subjectively by a common culture with shared meanings, values, norms, and so on. Culture is the invisible glue that bonds millions of individuals into one society. Society is made up of individuals, but society is more than just a collection of individuals. As the saying goes, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. Society is not just a bunch of people. Society is an overarching structure or system which organizes people. Society has its own logic, its own rules, its own order, which can only be understood by looking at the big picture. You can't understand society by breaking it down into individuals because society operates on a higher level than the individual. This means that you can't explain social issues in individual terms. And yet, even though Comte said this about 200 years ago, media and politicians persist in doing just that to this day. For example, many thousands of people are unemployed, and the media sometimes tell us that it's because every individual one of them is a lazy bum who doesn't want to work, instead of looking at the structure of the economy and how many jobs it creates or fails to create. Or many thousands of people become criminals and get put in jail. And politicians tell us that it's because every individual one of them is mad or bad, insane or immoral, psycho or just plain evil, instead of looking at the social problems that really cause crime, such as unemployment, poverty, racism, and so on. Comte had very grandiose ambitions, both for himself and his new discipline of sociology. He declared that developing a scientific understanding of society was even more important than understanding nature. Sociology would eventually be of greater service to humanity than any other branch of science, because understanding how society works would allow us to make it work better, or to function more efficiently. Unfortunately for Comte, European academia was not yet ready to accept his new discipline, and he had difficulty obtaining academic employment, much less getting his ideas listened to. His failure in conventional academic channels prompted him to take a new approach. He declared that sociology was not only both a philosophy and a science, it was also a religion. He was the high priest of the religion of sociology, and he declared that someday the whole world would be run by sociologist priests. This religious turn has undermined Comte's scientific reputation, but at the time it greatly increased his popularity, and the religion of sociology attracted followers across Western Europe during Comte's life. I would like to briefly draw a historical comparison here and argue that what Comte did in the 19th century is very similar to what L. Ron Hubbard did in the 20th century. Hubbard could not make a living as a science fiction writer, so he modified his science fiction into the so-called science of Dianetics. When this was discredited by real scientists, he doubled down and converted it into the Church of Scientology. With its belief in ancient space aliens, this so-called religion is in practice just repackaged science fiction. However, where Hubbard couldn't make a living promoting his ideas as either science fiction or science, he made a fortune by turning them into a religion. Similarly, Comte could not make a living out of promoting sociology as either philosophy or science, but he did well for himself by rebranding it as a religion, although of course no one sees sociology that way anymore. The next major figure in the structuralist tradition was Herbert Spencer, who lived from 1820 to 1903. Spencer was the first English language sociologist. The extent to which he directly built on Comte's work is debatable, because Spencer always insisted that all of his ideas were completely original. However, where Comte developed positive philosophy, Spencer developed synthetic philosophy, which sounds like and says much the same. And like Comte, Spencer took a model from biology to explain the functioning of society. The main difference between them was that Spencer was much more involved in the growing debate on biological evolution. Spencer argued that both biological and social evolution took place through what he termed the survival of the fittest. Several years later, Charles Darwin gave this process the less catchy but more scientific term natural selection. Whatever its name, it means that the strong survive and reproduce while the weak die off. So over time, the species evolves by getting fitter or better able to survive. With its emphasis on evolution, Spencer's work focuses more on social change than Comte's relatively static model, and it also focuses more on conflict, where Comte focused on cooperation. So to some extent, these two founding fathers of sociology balance each other out. But, like Comte, Spencer eventually took his ideas to an extreme. He argued that society should consciously imitate nature. In nature, The strong survive and the weak die, and that is as it should be. Spencer said society should be the same. The already very limited social programs and state supports of the 19th century should all be abolished, said Spencer, and the poor and weak should literally be allowed to die. Moreover, all government regulation of the economy should also be abolished so that businesses could compete for survival on the open market just as animals compete in nature. Over time, this would make the economy and humanity fitter, stronger, and better. Even though it was originally promoted by Spencer, this approach became termed social Darwinism simply because Darwin became more famous than Spencer. Social Darwinism gained a following in the 19th century and is still popular in some right-wing circles. However, it lost most of its luster in the 1930s. The Great Depression showed the world what unfettered free market capitalism led to: speculation, stock market crashes, bankruptcies, and millions of people thrown suddenly into unemployment and poverty. Letting the poor starve became a real possibility as inadequate social programs could not cope with millions in poverty. But the solution Western society chose was not to let them starve, but to build a welfare state to help them, the exact opposite of Spencer's recommendations. Aside from its dubious morality, the main problem with Spencer's theory is that he forgot that he was making a comparison. Human beings are like animals, but we're not the same. Evolution among animals works partly, not entirely as Spencer thought, but partly through the survival of the fittest. The strong animals kill the weak animals, so over time the gene pool improves. Spencer and the eugenics movement, which built on his work, believed that the same held true for humanity. What appeared callous in the short term would be beneficial in the long term. However, this theory has proven to be oversimplified, because humans are much more complex than animals. A human can be physically weak, but still contribute to society mentally, as with the quadriplegic cosmologist Stephen Hawking. Today, it's widely accepted that those once termed disabled may just be differently abled. They may be able to contribute in ways that normally abled people cannot. But that is not an idea that was in currency when Spencer wrote. More broadly, one cannot just separate people with bad genes from people with good genes. We all have the same basic human genes, just in different combinations. And a gene combination that's useless in one social context may become valuable in another. For example, a talent for video games was a skill which lay dormant for millennia, but which can now earn large sums of money. Among animals, fitness can be measured readily in terms of relative size and strength. But among humans, fitness can mean almost anything. While size and strength are still useful, much more importance is placed on having access to social resources like money and power. On The Simpsons, power plant owner Montgomery Burns is so physically weak that he can't even open a door for himself. But in social terms, he is the most powerful person in Springfield. It's not possible to breed people to develop such subtle mental abilities as business savvy, which is probably the single most important measure of fitness in capitalist society. Spencer also forgot that he was making another comparison. Social evolution may work like biological evolution, but it's not the same thing. Spencer wanted to change society to spur on human biological evolution by letting the weak die. But social evolution is about the evolution of society, not biology. Society is made up of social institutions, social structures, and social relationships. Those are the things that sociologists study, not biology. Social evolution consists of changes in those things, not in our gene pool. Positive social evolution does not consist of improving the gene pool. It consists of modifying our current social institutions so that they can allow more people to survive and to survive better. In short, it's about building a better society. The welfare state is an example of positive social evolution, as it has enabled the survival and improved the living standards of millions of people. The destruction of that welfare state, as Spencer proposed, would be an example of negative social evolution, a step backwards in social terms. Removing the social safety net would not only be physically harmful to the millions who depend on it, it would also be subjectively harmful to society's culture as a whole, by replacing caring and compassion for those less fortunate with indifference and even brutality. It would be a step backwards in moral terms as well as in practical terms. Despite this, the struggle over funding for the welfare state remains one of the central political issues of our time. Comte's work was more explicitly taken up by another Frenchman, Emile Durkheim, who lived from 1858 to 1917. Durkheim remains one of the big names in classical sociological theory to this day, together with Karl Marx, Max Weber, and Georg Simmel. Durkheim developed a much more sophisticated structuralist model of society than Comte. He agreed with Comte's positivist approach that sociology had to be a science that based itself on scientific facts. The problem was, said Durkheim, that Comte himself was an armchair theorist. He borrowed a model from biology and applied it to society, but he never actually did any empirical research to test his model against the facts. Durkheim was one of the first sociologists to collect facts and statistics to back up his theories. Durkheim argued that sociology needs to examine social facts, which he defined as social structures and cultural norms external to and coercive of individual actors. In other words, social facts are things in society that are bigger and more powerful than the individual, and that the individual has to fit into. There are material or objective social facts like the economy, and non-material or subjective social facts like norms and values. Like Comte, Durkheim attempted to explain the relationship between the objective and subjective sides of society, and, like Comte, he addressed the problem of order. To explain the objective side of society, Durkheim borrowed a concept from economics: division of labor. Division of labor refers to how the work is divided up in the economy, who does what job and how they all work together. Durkheim expanded this concept to apply to society as a whole. He argued that everything that people do while playing social roles contributes to the objective side of society. So, when Durkheim argued that the division of labor increases over time, he meant not only that the economy has grown more complex, but that society as a whole has grown more complex. Nevertheless, the economy is at the heart of society's division of labor, and the economy has to keep increasing its division of labor to keep up with population pressure. Virtually all social theorists agree that because the human population keeps growing, the economy has to keep getting more efficient and producing more so as to provide all those people with food, clothing, shelter, and so on. Early hunting and gathering tribes had a simple gender-based division of labor. Men did hunting and warfare, women did gathering and childcare. Later agricultural societies had a more complex division of labor with specialized jobs like blacksmith, merchant, priest, and so on. However, most people became farmers with again a simple gender-based division of labor, with men working in the fields and women working in the farmhouse. Modern industrial society, on the other hand, has created an explosion in the division of labor, with thousands upon thousands of increasingly specialized jobs out there. This is why industrial society can produce far more than any pre-industrial society. Division of labor ties society together in objective terms because the more each individual specializes, the less he can survive on his own, and the more he needs other people all playing their specialized roles for their mutual survival. However, said Durkheim, for social order to be maintained, society must be tied together in both objective and subjective terms. Subjectively, society is tied together by its collective conscience, or conscience collective, which Durkheim defined as, quote, the totality of beliefs and sentiments common to the average citizens of the same society. Obviously, not everyone in society is going to think the same way, but there has to be a majority that adhere to common beliefs, norms, values, in a word, to a common culture. Durkheim also argued that the collective conscience changes as society changes, and that its strength can grow or decline depending on social circumstances. If the collective conscience is strong, society is peaceful, orderly, and law-abiding. If the collective conscience is weak, society sees an increase in crime, violence, and public protests. Durkheim argued that the strength of society's collective conscience primarily depends upon that society's social solidarity, which he defined as a shared subjective feeling of togetherness. The members of a society must feel solidarity with other members of their society, or that society will fall apart. Canada provides a perfect example of this. Quebec. Whether Quebec remains a part of Canada or separates ultimately depends on whether the people of Quebec feel solidarity with all Canadians or only with Quebec francophones. If Quebecers eventually decide that they don't feel Canadian but only Québécois, then Canadian society will literally fall apart. While this doesn't currently seem likely, it remains a possibility for the future. Durkheim connected the objective to the subjective sides of society by connecting division of labor to social solidarity. He argued that, as the division of labor has grown, social solidarity has had to change. Specifically, he drew a distinction between mechanical solidarity, which existed in pre-industrial societies, and organic solidarity, which exists in modern industrial societies. Mechanical solidarity is based on everybody doing the same jobs. Organic solidarity is based on everybody doing different jobs. Durkheim uses the terms mechanical and organic essentially to mean simple and complex. A machine is a simple structure, a biological organism is a complex structure. Pre-industrial societies have a simple division of labor and a simple social solidarity based on sameness. When everybody does the same jobs and lives the same lives, they'll all tend to think the same, and it's pretty easy for them all to see that they're all in it together, whether they belong to a hunting and gathering tribe or a farming village. So pre-industrial societies were held together subjectively by mechanical solidarity, which promoted a culture based on sameness, with an emphasis on conformity and also on tradition, always doing things the same way. But then came the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries. Most of the Western population left their farms and came to the cities, where they met all kinds of people doing all kinds of jobs. Mechanical solidarity broke down, but was replaced by organic solidarity. Industrial society needs social solidarity even more than pre-industrial society. Pre-industrial societies largely consisted of families that were mostly self-sufficient. But in industrial society, nobody's self-sufficient. Everybody needs thousands of other people doing their jobs for each one of us to survive. So industrial society has developed a more complex form of social solidarity based on diversity, with a culture that emphasizes individuality and constant change. However, said Durkheim, between the collapse of mechanical solidarity and the rise of organic solidarity, society went through a period of anomie. Anomie may be defined as alienation or separation or social isolation. Anomie is what happens when individuals become separated from society and socially isolated. Anomie emerges when social ties break down and social structures break down. Anomie is an absence of structure, a state of normlessness. Durkheim argued that when our social ties break down, we lose touch with society's norms and values. We lose our social guidelines, and we become lost and confused. Life loses its meaning for us, and we lose our sense of purpose in life. Anomie can emerge due to a social upheaval or a personal upheaval. On the social scale, anomie emerges due to social upheavals like war, revolution, economic depression, and the breakdown of agricultural society due to the Industrial Revolution. On the individual scale, anomie emerges due to personal upheavals like bereavement, divorce, unemployment, and so on. If you suddenly lose your spouse and your family, or your job and your workmates, then you've lost your most important social ties and you feel abruptly cut off from society. Durkheim argued that when we lose touch with society's structures, we lose touch with the social guidelines for action which they provide. As a result, we become lost and confused. We don't know how we're supposed to act. Durkheim argued that persons who fall into a state of anomie become much more likely to commit acts which are violent, destructive, and/or self-destructive. And he collected statistics to back up that claim. First, he showed that the time period of the Industrial Revolution did indeed have a significant increase in crime and violence, as his theory predicted. But he was more interested in how anomie led to self-destructive acts, such as alcoholism, drug use, and especially the ultimate self-destructive act, suicide. In Durkheim's day, and to some extent still today, suicide was explained in individual psychological terms. Basically, if you committed suicide, it was because you were crazy. Durkheim argued that even though it was normally committed by individuals acting alone, suicide was still a social act, which had to be understood in social terms. He argued that people committed suicide when they had lost their social ties. Human beings need other human beings subjectively as well as objectively. We don't just need each other because we have to work together to survive. We also subjectively need human contact to stay human and to give our lives meaning. This is why prisoners put in long-term solitary confinement almost always end up attempting or committing suicide. The sheer crushing loneliness of social isolation leads to depression, which leads to suicide. Durkheim wrote a book on suicide, which he called Suicide, published in 1897. In this book, he collected statistics to back up his theory that anomie causes suicide. I'm not going to go through all of them, but for example, he compared unemployment statistics to suicide statistics, and he found a clear connection. When unemployment rates went up, suicide rates went up. When unemployment rates went down, suicide rates went down. This situation has not changed since Durkheim's day. Modern statistics show exactly the same thing. Unemployment is a clear cause of suicide. Durkheim also studied bereavement statistics and found that those persons whose spouse had recently died were also a high suicide risk. These days, families break up less due to bereavement than divorce. But Durkheim's basic point is confirmed by modern statistics, which show that divorce rates also correlate with suicide rates. Divorce can cause suicide. One other factor that Durkheim looked at that I want to mention is age. When you're a young child, you normally have a family that provides you with structure and strong social ties. You know your place in the world, you know what is expected of you in the role of child. Then, when you get older, you get a job, you get married, you have kids, and again, you have strong structural ties to society. But in between these two ages, there is an age of uncertainty, the late teens and early 20s. This can be a stage of anomie. When you're a child, you know who you are. When you're a parent, you know who you are. But in between, you might not know who you are. You're not a child anymore. People are expecting you to stand on your own feet, but you don't know what you want to do with your life. This is why these days we have teen suicide hotlines. We don't have middle-aged suicide hotlines because middle-aged people rarely commit suicide. Teenagers, on the other hand, can feel lost, confused, alone in a crowd, lacking in purpose, and are therefore high suicide risks. If you feel that way, the thing to remember is, don't do anything final, because, as the saying goes, it's just a phase. Over time, you will grow out of it. Your life will become more meaningful as you become more socially embedded, more a part of society. However, there are also those who deliberately prey on teenagers in a state of anomie, such as religious cults. Cults send out recruiters to places like bus stations and train stations looking for teenage runaways. Teenage runaways have cut themselves off from their families and their whole previous lives, so they are in a state of complete anomie. The recruiter approaches them and offers them, in effect, a new family to replace their old one. He says, "If your life lacks purpose, then come with me and we will give you the greatest purpose of all, doing God's work." And pretty soon the teen is working all day for room and board, basically as slave labor, making the leaders of the cult rich. And in extreme cases, such as Jonestown or Waco, Texas, when the leader of the cult told his followers that God wanted them to join him now, they committed mass suicide. In Jonestown, mothers fed their babies poisoned Kool-Aid. In Waco, they burned themselves to death. This illustrates another point made by Durkheim. Suicide can be caused by too much structure as well as too little structure. Durkheim was a believer in what these days is called the Goldilocks principle. Too much is bad, too little is bad, a moderate amount is good. We all need a moderate amount of structure in our lives. Too little structure can lead to anomic suicide, which is suicide caused by anomy or lack of social ties. But too much structure can lead to altruistic suicide. This happens when the individual loses their individuality and becomes completely immersed in the collective. So, when the cult leader says, everybody commits suicide, everybody commits suicide. However, said Durkheim, sometimes society needs people to commit altruistic suicide, as in times of war. Soldiers have to be prepared to lay down their lives to defend their country. Now, normally, people don't want to risk their lives, so their way of thinking has to be changed when they join the army. The army does this by de-emphasizing each recruit's individuality and emphasizing their new collective identity. The army takes away your individuality in a variety of ways. First of all, civilians express their individuality by all wearing different clothes. Well, the army takes those away and instead gives you a uniform, which literally means the same. Civilians also express their individuality by all having different hairstyles, or at least young people who still have hair do so. So the army shaves everyone's hair down to half an inch, so you all look even more the same. You're taught to march, which means all walking together the same. You all eat the same thing at the same time. You all sleep in the same barracks. You all go to bed at the same time and get up at the same time. In short, you do nothing as an individual, everything as a group. Then on top of that, you're told about the glorious traditions of your regiment and the battles they won, and you're shown the flags and the medals and so on. And once they've done all that to you, then you believe that the army is more important than any individual, including yourself, and you're ready to kill or be killed to help your army win the war. Durkheim also connected his concept of anomy with division of labor. He argued that modern industrial society has developed an anomic division of labor, meaning a division of labor with a growing separation between social classes. Durkheim noted that in pre-industrial society, businesses normally consisted of a master and several apprentices. The apprentices were often the sons and other relatives of the master. But even if they weren't kin, this was a family business with a paternal relationship. Apprentices would learn the trade and become masters when they grew older. So there was no great social gap between master and apprentice. But this all changed with the rise of industrial society. Family businesses gave way to impersonal corporations, and a huge social gap opened up between employers and employees. Employers have grown richer and richer, while most employees continue to just barely get by. Durkheim also called this a forced division of labor. On the one hand, industrial society creates lots of new kinds of jobs, which gives people a better chance to express their individuality by giving them a bigger choice of careers. But, on the other hand, industrial society also creates conditions of unemployment and poverty, which forces the majority of people to accept any job they can get, even a mindless, repetitive job on an assembly line, at any wage they can get. And Durkheim also called it a pathological division of labor. If society is like a biological organism, as Comte argued, then our society is a sick organism. It is afflicted with the pathology of growing social inequality. For Durkheim, a moderate level of inequality is good. But modern industrial society tends to push inequality to extremes. The rich become obscenely rich, while the poor starve. Moreover, people gradually become aware that the rich are effectively above the law. The rich get away with routinely stealing millions of dollars, while the poor go to jail for stealing a few bucks to buy groceries. As people become aware of this, they lose respect for the law. The law is supposed to embody society's values and morals, its collective conscience. But if the law doesn't apply to the rich, then society in general loses its belief in the collective conscience and loses its belief in the law. This can lead to social disruption, such as rioting, most commonly by poor ethnic minorities. We can see this with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. Once a significant number of young black men had been shot and killed by white police officers, the black community responded with rioting in a number of cities. When black people come to believe that the law only serves white people, it is inevitable that they will take action outside the law, because that's the only option left to them. Durkheim hoped that democracy could cure modern society. Early democracy came with a property qualification, which meant that you had to prove you owned a significant amount of property or money to be allowed to vote or stand for political office. In other words, early democracy was quite explicitly democracy for the rich only. This property qualification gradually diminished through the 19th century, but it was only after World War I ended in 1918 that it was abolished and universal suffrage was brought in, meaning one person, one vote. Durkheim did not quite live to see this, as he died in 1917. But he believed that true democracy with universal suffrage would lead to the rise of a new social contract. He argued that the leaders of all of society's main social groups would get elected, and together they'd come to an agreement on a more fair and just division of labor, and a more fair and just division of the rewards of that labor, leading to a society with less inequality and a stronger collective conscience. Durkheim's idea of a new social contract grew in popularity, and after World War II it appeared to be informally put in place. The welfare state was built, social inequality declined, and the rich accepted higher taxes in return for a decline in social protests and low strike levels. However, it did not last. Since what was then called the New Right took over Western politics in the early 80s, government policies have mostly consisted of providing tax cuts for the rich and social program cuts for the rest. And inequality has steadily grown, not just in the West, but globally. The result, as Durkheim predicted, has been an increase in public acts of violence, such as school shootings, suicide bombers, terrorism, and so on. As global inequality grows, anomie grows, and so do acts that are destructive and self-destructive. The solution to these social problems is not more police and more soldiers, but more equality and more justice. There's just one final aspect of Durkheim's work that I want to briefly look at, and that is his work on religion. Durkheim wondered where the religious impulse came from. Where did people get the idea that there exists this whole other plane of existence inhabited by spirits and gods? To answer that question, Durkheim began at the beginning and examined early tribal societies. He was struck by the widespread practice of totemism. In North America, we're familiar with totem poles, but totems don't have to be poles. A totem is a symbolic representation, a carving or a painting, of an animal which symbolizes the tribe. More precisely, the spirit of the animal symbolizes those spiritual values which the tribe emphasizes. If the tribe emphasizes strength, it might pick a bear totem because the bear is strong. If the tribe emphasizes wisdom, it might pick the eagle because the eagle flies high and so is far-seeing, and so on. For Durkheim, what matters most here is that social values are being expressed in spiritual terms. The tribe's identity is being expressed in symbolic form. The totem provides a clear focus which strengthens social solidarity. And a stronger sense of social solidarity helps the tribe to work together and survive together. The totem gives each individual the sense of belonging to something bigger than himself. It provides him with meaning and purpose. So, for Durkheim, when we talk about the spiritual realm and about God, we're really talking about society. Religion tells us that God is invisible, but yet is all around us, and that God is all-seeing, all-knowing, and all-powerful. Well, said Durkheim, that's society. Society is invisible. You can't point to it and say, look, there's Canadian society going down the road. And yet it's all around us. Society contains all knowledge, it sees everything, and it is vastly more powerful than any individual. Society created the values and morals that religion attributes to God. So, for Durkheim, society is God, and religion is like an early primitive form of sociology. It's a way of understanding society, but put in personal terms, in terms of spirits, instead of the impersonal terms of modern science. Durkheim died in the same year as the Russian Revolution, 1917. The success of the Russian Revolution convinced many European sociologists that communism or Marxism was the way of the future. So, after Durkheim's death, Marxism came to dominate European sociology and structuralism went into a decline. However, it did not die. Instead, it immigrated to the US. In the 1910s, American Robert Park developed the theory of human ecology, which argued that society develops in a manner analogous to the ecology, thereby expanding on Comte's organic analogy. Like Spencer, Park was particularly struck by the role of competition for resources in shaping both nature and society. In the 20s, after he'd moved to the University of Chicago, Park teamed up with Ernest Burgess to expand his theory into urban ecology. They studied the growth of the city of Chicago and concluded that it had been shaped by groups engaging in competition for urban resources like land. Affluent groups raised the rent in their neighborhoods, forcing poorer people to live in poorer neighborhoods or slums. In this way, cities got divided up into ecological niches. Moreover, as affluent groups moved out to the suburbs, they established concentric zones or rings of people in the same socioeconomic category. This means that the physical and social structure of cities like Chicago is similar to the structure of tree rings. Social processes create structures similar to those created by natural processes. At Harvard in the 1930s, Talcott Parsons developed the approach he called structural functionalism. As the name implies, this theory sees society as made up of social structures performing specialized functions, the same as Comte and Durkheim. Parsons wrote about Durkheim and explicitly built on Durkheim's work. The main difference between them was that Parsons was much less critical of the society he lived in than Durkheim was. Parsons said that Durkheim was right to criticize European society because it had a very rigid and unequal class structure that had been set up and run by a hereditary aristocracy. But the US had never had an aristocracy or a monarchy, so it was a society of relative equality. Indeed, said Parsons, the US might not be perfect, but it was the society with the highest level of equality and freedom the world had ever seen. In particular, Parsons compared America to the Soviet Union. After World War II, the world entered the age of the Cold War between America and Russia, between capitalism and communism. Parsons argued that the Soviet Union was held together by coercion, by force, at the point of a gun. But he said that that could only work for so long, and therefore that the Soviet Union would eventually fall apart. He was quite right, even though he didn't live to see it. Parsons died in 1979, and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. By contrast with the Soviet Union, Parsons argued that the US was held together by consensus, or a widespread acceptance of common beliefs and values. Indeed, Parsons emphasized consensus so much that his approach has been termed a consensus theory. As such, it's been contrasted with Marxism, which has been termed a conflict theory. Parsons emphasized agreement and cooperation in society. Marx emphasized disagreement and conflict, especially class conflict. I would argue that you need to look at both sides, cooperation and conflict, to get a balanced understanding of society. Parsons argued that the US had a consensus regarding basic values, especially in the fields of politics, economics, and culture. In politics, most Americans believe that democracy is the best political system. In economics, most Americans believed in the free market, and in culture, most Americans believed in free speech. American society embodied these values and so had the support of the vast majority of Americans. Parsons became by far North America's leading sociologist through the 30s, 40s, and 50s, but his work was challenged in the 60s, first by Marxists and then by feminists. The critics argued that Parsons' cozy, functionless model of society, where everything serves a purpose and everything works together to create the best possible society, may well be true for middle-class white men, like Parsons himself, but it didn't hold true for everybody. American society was not so functional for the poor or ethnic minorities or women. The 1960s was when the consensus that Parsons saw in the US broke down as all sorts of protest movements emerged. The anti-Vietnam War movement, the student movement, the Black Civil Rights movement, the Women's Liberation movement, and so on. Parsons was criticized for ignoring the US's social problems and for being too conservative and too right-wing. Parsons was also criticized for what I like to call terminological inflation, or big words for small ideas. Parsons invented his own terminology as he went along, and critics said that you needed a Parsons to English dictionary just to understand him. And once you did, you realized that he just created an elaborate categorization scheme with his own idiosyncratic labels, but that he hadn't actually said much of anything. For example, one of Parsons' best-known theories is his so-called Agile model, A-G-I-L. He argued that every society had to perform 4 basic functions: adaptation, goal attainment, integration, and latency, Agile. But now that I've told you that, you're absolutely no wiser, are you? Like I said, Parsons invented his own language. Agile roughly corresponds to economics, politics, the law, and culture. Those are certainly 4 basic social functions and social structures, but I would argue that Parsons' terminology just confuses things. Parsons was also criticized for illegitimate teleology. Teleology is the theory that things come into existence for a specific purpose. When you apply that theory to social structures, some teleology clearly is legitimate or correct. Society clearly does create specialized organizations to perform specific functions. For example, here in Saskatchewan we have crown corporations that were specifically created to run our utilities: Sask Power, Sask Energy, SaskTel, and so on. This means that you can explain the existence of these structures in terms of the function they perform for society. However, critics argue that the same cannot be said of our basic social structures, like the family or the state. These structures did not come into existence with a specific preordained purpose or function, because they can perform many different functions, and in the course of history their functions have changed many times. For example, what families and governments do today is very different from what they did 1,000 or 10,000 years ago. This means that you cannot explain their existence in terms of the functions they're performing at any one time, and trying to do so is illegitimate teleology. American Robert Merton, who eventually became probably the second most famous structural functionalist, said that Parsons had fallen into the trap of illegitimate teleology because he'd forgotten one thing. There are always functional alternatives, meaning there are always different ways of doing the same thing. A given function can be performed by several different structures, and a given structure can perform several different functions. For example, every society needs to have some structure that performs the function of growing food. But that function can be performed by family farms, workers' cooperatives, religious communes, slave plantations, state-run farms, or agribusiness corporations, among other social structures. Similarly, the modern state performs many different functions, creating the army, the police, schools, healthcare, social programs, and so on. So, when Parsons says society is made up of these structures performing these functions, he is describing society, but he's not answering the most important sociological question. Why? Why these structures performing these functions and not others? This meant that Parsons' work was descriptive, not analytical. He described social structures and the functions they performed, but that didn't explain why those structures existed or why they worked the way they did. Merton developed a more balanced, a more sophisticated, and a more critical model of society than Parsons did. Merton recognized that Comte's organic analogy had its limitations. He argued that it only really applied to early tribal societies. It applied there because a tribe is essentially a large family. And in a family, everyone cares about everyone else, everything is shared, and everyone does indeed work together for the good of the tribe as a whole. So a tribe does work like a biological organism. But modern industrial society consists of many different social structures, businesses, governments, schools, churches, and so on. Each of these structures has a large degree of independence in terms of how it operates. This means that these structures do not just cooperate like the organs in a body. They also sometimes come in conflict. Different sections of society develop different interests, so conflicts of interest emerge, which sometimes lead to violent conflict. This also means, said Merton, that social structures can emerge which are not functional for society as a whole, but only for part of society. This brings us to another concept which Merton introduced to make structural functionalism a more balanced theory, the concept of dysfunction. Merton pointed out that everything has its pros and its cons. Every structure has not only positive functions, but also negative dysfunctions. This means that social structures can be functional for some people, but dysfunctional for others. In particular, Western society contains structures which are functional for the rich and powerful, but dysfunctional for the majority of society. Structures that make the rich richer by making the rest of society poorer. As long as the people at the top continue to benefit, these structures will persist, even if they're harming the majority. Merton also argued that dysfunctions arise because every structure has both manifest functions, which are what the structure was intended to do, and latent functions, which are unintended side effects. Merton argued that latent functions emerge because we never know all the consequences of our actions. So they have unanticipated consequences. Manifest functions are normally positive and functional, but latent functions are generally negative and dysfunctional. Nobody deliberately sets out to create something dysfunctional, but dysfunctions appear anyway. That's just part of how the world works. In short, Merton made structural functionalism a more balanced theory by introducing theoretical concepts to explain the negative side of society as well as the positive side. Parsons' most prominent student was Niklas Luhmann, who evolved structural functionalism into systems theory by combining it with ideas taken from the natural sciences, both new developments in old disciplines like biology and in new disciplines like computer science and cybernetics. Like Merton, he criticized Parsons for not recognizing the existence of functional alternatives, or what he termed contingency, the fact that things could always be done differently. Luhmann examined how systems arise and concluded that it was through a process of autopoiesis, which means self-making or self-organizing. Society has the ability of self-reference, meaning it constantly monitors itself and establishes feedback loops to correct any problems that arise. As you can see, Luhmann also picked up Parsons' habit of making up his own terminology as he went along. Probably the single best-known structural functionalist work was written jointly by Americans Kingsley Davis and Wilbert Moore. In the 1940s, they published their theory of social inequality, or as they termed it, social stratification. This term once more takes us away from Comte's organic analogy and instead draws a mechanical or inorganic analogy between society and geology. The Earth is made up of many strata or layers, soil, clay, rock, and so on. Similarly, society contains social strata, established by income and wealth, ranging people from rich to poor. Davis and Moore begin by noting that every single society in the world contains some form of social inequality or stratification. Therefore, inequality must be functional for society as a whole. Inequality would not exist the world over if it weren't doing something positive for society. The question is, what? What function does inequality perform for society? The answer that Davis and Moore provide is motivation. Inequality motivates people to work hard so as to hopefully get rich and at least avoid poverty. When everyone is motivated to work their hardest, society as a whole benefits. The economy expands, so there's more wealth for everyone. Even the poor eventually benefit because countries with developed economies can afford social programs that help the poor. Moreover, when everyone is motivated to work their hardest, the cream rises to the top. That is to say, the most talented people rise to the top social positions. Davis and Moore argue that there is a biological scarcity of talent, meaning that there is only a relatively small number of really talented people. They argue that it is important for society that the most talented people fill the most functionally important positions. For example, a surgeon has an important job because he literally has people's lives in his hands. If you have to have surgery, you don't want some idiot slicing you open. You want a surgeon who's proven his talent and intelligence by getting through medical school. But in order to motivate people to go through medical school, there has to be a payoff in terms of higher income once you graduate. Nobody's going to go through years of medical school if they can get a job that pays them the same money fresh out of high school. So for Davis and Moore, stratification actually begins with human biology. As the nature-nurture debate shows, human beings are a combination of biology and society. Davis and Moore argue that biology and society must fit together. They argue that they're both stratified. Human biology is stratified in terms of talent. It can be ranged on a spectrum from most talented, the smartest, the strongest, and so on, down to the least talented. Similarly, social positions are stratified in terms of their functional importance, from the most important to the least important. For society, to function optimally, the most talented people must take on the most important positions, while the less talented take on the less important positions. However, in the past, that did not always happen. In pre-industrial societies, most social positions were ascribed or inherited. If you were born an aristocrat, you stayed an aristocrat. If you were born a peasant, you stayed a peasant. There was very little social mobility. You did what your parents did, whether you had the talent for it or not. But in modern Western societies, like the US, only a minority of social positions are still ascribed. Most are achieved. These days, you can rise up the social ladder through talent and hard work, because capitalism has created a job market with open competition. May the best applicant win. Yes, there is still discrimination by race, gender, and so on, but that is slowly declining. And overall, said Davis and Moore, the US has greater equality of opportunity than any other country in world history. When everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed, and everyone is motivated to succeed, then talent makes the difference, and everyone gets fitted into society at their appropriate level of talent. That is why we need a system of unequal rewards, said Davis and Moore. Taking on the most functionally important jobs involves getting a lot of education, taking on a lot of responsibility, and working really hard. Nobody's going to do that unless they get paid more. And, said Davis and Moore, they deserve to get paid more. Performing the most functionally important jobs means that they're contributing more to society than other people, so it's only right that society rewards them more highly. And, said Davis and Moore, most people agree with them. They argue that there's a general consensus in American society that some jobs deserve to be paid more highly than others. They argued that most Americans support the existing structure of social stratification. Davis and Moore's theory became very popular in the 40s and 50s, but, like structural functionalism in general, it came under heavy attack in the 60s. First of all, they were accused of being empirically incorrect in saying that the most functionally important jobs get paid the most. Because the jobs that are the most functionally important for our survival are the farmers who grow the food we need to survive, and the workers who build the homes and make the products we need to survive. And yet these are two of the lowest paid jobs in Western society. Meanwhile, the least functionally important jobs get paid the most. Which jobs are those? Actors, musicians, sportspersons, celebrities. In a word, entertainers. Now, I'm as big a sports fan as the next guy, but entertainment is clearly not society's most important function, and yet it's paid as if it were. Top entertainers can earn 100 times as much as the average person, or even more. So, just on empirical, factual grounds, Davis and Moore's theory is, at least partly, incorrect. This criticism was extended into theoretical terms with the argument that Davis and Moore had engaged in circular reasoning. They never properly defined what made jobs more or less functionally important. They just assumed that if a job was paid more, that meant it was more functionally important. And then they said that its greater functional importance was why it was paid more. So, they're getting paid more because the job's more important, and the job's more important because they're getting paid more. That's circular reasoning. It may sound good at first, but it doesn't actually explain anything. Davis and Moore's central focus on motivation was also criticized. It was argued that unequal rewards are not the only way to motivate people. For a start, there's also job satisfaction. Talented, intelligent people don't want to do mindless, menial jobs simply because they'll be bored. They want to take on more challenging, more responsible positions because they'll get a higher level of job satisfaction from them. For example, now that the US has privatized healthcare, American doctors can earn millions of dollars a year. The Scandinavian countries, such as Sweden and Norway, have state-run healthcare, so their doctors earn a good middle-class income, but much less than American doctors. And yet, Scandinavia has a significantly higher number of doctors per person than the US. This is because the primary motivation to become a doctor is not the desire to make a ton of money, but the satisfaction gained from helping other people and even saving lives. Just one other motivator I'm going to look at: independence. Every year in every Western country, thousands of people quit well-paying government or corporate jobs and start their own businesses. The majority of them have to shut down inside 18 months, losing their life savings in the process. Most of those that survive can expect to work longer hours for less money than if they'd stayed in their old jobs. And yet they persist. Why? Because for many people, not having a boss standing over you, telling you what to do all the time, is worth a cut in income. For some, independence is a bigger motivator than money. In short, nobody's denying that money is a motivator. Of course it is. But it's not the only motivator. So, do we really need to pay some people so much more than others when there are other ways to motivate them? More important, responsible jobs generally have higher levels of job satisfaction and independence, so talented people will do them, even if they're not paid far more than others. Next, Davis and Moore's concept of a biological scarcity of talent was questioned. Again, this goes back to the nature-nurture debate. Biology provides potential talent, but society must bring out that talent. So, certainly, there is a range of talent in society, and certainly biology plays a part in that. But so does society. Talent must be brought out through the education system. And although Davis and Moore might like to believe that modern education is a system with equality of opportunity, the sad fact is that it's not. A central issue in the sociology of education has always been the problem of working class underachievement, meaning that the children of the working class, on average, don't do as well in school as the children of the middle and upper classes. This is not because they are biologically or genetically inferior. It happens for many reasons, but primarily just because those with more money can provide their kids with more resources. Fancy computers, private tutors, whatever it takes. Meanwhile, the working class kid may have to take a part-time job, which doesn't leave much time or energy for studying. So of course the richer kids do better in school. In short, there's not so much a biological scarcity of talent as a socially created scarcity of talent. The working class, which is the majority of society, are not given the resources and opportunities to learn and develop their talents to the full. If inequality was reduced and less money was given to the upper class and more to the working class, then far more people would be able to achieve their potential, and there'd be no scarcity of talent at all. So the critics argue that, at least in some ways, inequality is actually dysfunctional for society, for example, by wasting human talent. Marxists argue that society is made up of four main classes: the upper class, the middle class, the working class, and the underclass, or the poor. And that Davis and Moore's model only really applies to middle-class professionals like themselves. The upper class either inherit their money or they earn it through business, which depends on the market, not on functional importance. The poor have largely been excluded from the labour market altogether, and the working class don't really have equality of opportunity. They have what's been called a segmented labour market, meaning there are different jobs for men and women, whites and blacks, and so on. Although sexism and racism are slowly declining, discrimination remains very much a part of working class life. Only the middle class escape this. For middle class professionals like managers, doctors, lawyers, and professors, the income gap has been steadily narrowing, so that today women and ethnic minorities earn on average virtually the same as white men. This means that education is a solution to discrimination. If you have the educational qualifications and the talent to back them up, then nobody cares anymore if you're a man or a woman, white or black. But if you don't have the education, then women and minority men can expect to earn significantly less than white men, which is one reason why going to university is a good idea. But Davis and Moore's meritocratic model, where success hinges strictly on ability and hard work, really only applies to the middle class, who make up at most only about 20% of society. So again, Davis and Moore's theory is at best only a partial model of inequality in society. And finally, Davis and Moore were criticized for their belief in consensus. In the first place, said the critics, there is no such consensus. Is there really a consensus that professional sports players should earn about 100 times what the average person does? Is there really a consensus that the average corporate CEO should earn over $10 million a year, which they currently do in Canada? I asked my students for over 30 years if they thought that was right, and I never even had one say that they did, let alone a majority. So there is no consensus on pay. And secondly, consensus is irrelevant because pay scales are not set by public opinion polls, they're set by the market. And today's market is dominated by large corporations. Corporations pay their workers not according to what the general public thinks or according to the functional importance of the jobs, but simply according to whatever will maximize corporate profits. And we shall look at that when we look at Marxism. In light of all these criticisms, it has become fashionable in recent years to dismiss Davis and Moore altogether. However, I would argue that their problem was not so much that they were wrong as that they only had part of the answer. They overlooked other motivators, but they were correct in saying that money is a very powerful motivator. They were over-optimistic in thinking that the working class had equality of opportunity, but they were correct in thinking that the middle class largely has it. They were also correct in arguing that if inequality exists in every single society, then it must be functional in some way. I would argue that inequality is functional in two ways, one general, one particular. In general terms, social inequality creates social diversity. Different people are put in different social positions, from rich to poor, which means they face different life problems and so have to come up with different solutions. This diversity improves society's overall adaptability. In Spencer's terms, it makes society fitter. It means that when a new problem comes along, there's more likely to be somebody with a solution for it. And in particular, money motivates the middle class to be creative. Middle class professionals are the ones who come up with new ways of doing things, new artworks, new knowledge, and above all, new technology. Technological progress has become central to modern industrial society. So as long as an unequal social structure continues to bring forth new technology, it will remain in use regardless of the social cost. But we need to remember that inequality does have its social cost. We need to remember that while inequality may be functional in some ways, it is also most definitely dysfunctional in other ways. It pushes millions of people into poverty and suffering. It wastes those people's potential and talent. While some inequality may be justified, there is no moral justification or functional necessity for the extreme and growing inequality which we've seen globally since the 80s. So that today we live in a world where less than a couple of thousand people are billionaires, while billions of other people live in hunger. As Durkheim said, a moderate level of inequality is functional for society, but too much inequality destabilizes society. Now, back when Davis and Moore developed their theory in the 1940s, Western countries were creating welfare states, average living standards were rising, inequality was falling, and the system seemed to be working well for everyone. Davis and Moore thought that would continue indefinitely, but it has not. Since the recession of the late 70s, social programs have been cut, living standards have flattened out, and inequality has risen sharply. Now, I don't think that Davis and Moore can be blamed for failing to foresee the future correctly. But I do think that this tells us that, as I've said, they've only seen a part of the whole picture, and so their theory only provides a partial explanation for social inequality. Now, you may have noticed that as I've gone over these theories, I've tried to relate them to what was happening in society at the time, because sociologists are people too. Sociologists are members of society, so the theories they come up with are affected by the society they live in. Which means that as society changes, sociological theory changes. When the US felt threatened by fascism in the 40s and communism in the 50s, American sociologists came up with very patriotic, conservative, pro-capitalist theories which were very popular at the time, like structural functionalism. But in the 60s, American society, politics, and culture as a whole swung sharply to the left. And so American sociology swung away from structural functionalism and towards Marxism and feminism. Structural functionalism declined in popularity as it was seen as too conservative and too right-wing. However, in the late 70s and early 80s, Western politics, especially in the English-speaking world, swung back to the right. So, structural functionalism was reborn in the work of American theorists like Jeffrey Alexander, who developed his theory of neo-functionalism, which just means the new functionalism. Alexander developed a more sophisticated form of structural functionalism, integrating ideas from other theories, such as Marxism's focus on economic rather than cultural factors, social conflict, social change, and so on. However, in the late 90s, Alexander declared that for him, the neo-functionalist project was complete, and he was going on to other things. In Britain, in the 80s, Anthony Giddens developed his structuration theory, and Margaret Archer developed her morphogenetic theory. Both seek to redefine our understanding of the relationship between structure and agency. Giddens has gone on to become one of the most prominent sociologists in the world. However, in the 90s, he turned away from abstract structuralist issues to focus on politics. He developed what he termed his third way between left-wing and right-wing, and his ideas became very influential when he became an advisor to Labour Party leader Tony Blair, who was Prime Minister of Britain from 1997 to 2007. Giddens' support of the Labour Party earned him the title of Baron Giddens in 2004. However, while structuration theory originally made him well known, his focus in the 21st century has been on politics, globalization, and the environment. Structuralist issues have taken a back seat. Outside of the English-speaking world, structuralism has gone into a decline, particularly due to the rise of French post-structuralism, which in practice means anti-structuralism. As post-structuralism has evolved into postmodernism, its rejection of structure in favor of subjectivist relativism has become widely accepted. I shall have more to say on this in my talks on subjectivism. In conclusion, however, I shall just say that I believe that structuralism will make a comeback in time. I believe this because theories are cyclical. They go in and out of fashion. One generation develops a theory about society, then it's forgotten under a barrage of criticism, but then the next generation rediscovers it but puts it in their own words. The terminology changes, but the basic ideas stay the same. History repeats itself with variations. It's almost as if there were an underlying structure to everything. And on that note, I conclude my history of structuralism. A written transcript of this talk is available in the video description box if you're interested. Good day all.